This is your commentator, Stan Dale. I'd like to take you back to September 1st, 1961. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Flight 529 took off from Chicago's Midway Airport, bound for Las Vegas, Nevada. There were 78 people on board, 73 passengers, 5 crew members. Approximately 4 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed in the southern part of it. The disaster set in motion a series of vital operations involving many dedicated people. Taking a key role in the post-disaster mission were the funeral directors of DuPage County, Illinois. When their work was concluded, tributes came from all parts of the nation. Mr. Billy M. Hopper, air safety investigator for the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington, D.C., stated, "The work of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association in this accident should be given wide publicity among their associates throughout the country. The value of their planning and cooperation cannot be overstressed." Mr. Roland C. Kennedy of the Federal Aviation Agency wrote, "Needless to say, our thankless task of medically investigating air carrier accidents would be considerably lightened were we to obtain the type of unselfish, dedicated cooperation given us by the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association. Their outstanding contribution should be recognized by more than the usual well done." One of the proudest moments experienced by those attending the annual convention of the National Funeral Directors Association in Minneapolis, Minnesota, occurred when an unprecedented citation was presented to the NFPA by the Federal Aviation Administration in grateful recognition of the outstanding public service of its members in DuPage County, Illinois, on September 1st, 1961. When the presentation ceremony ended, the more than 1,700 persons present rose in a 2-minute ovation for their fellow members whose accomplishments had brought them this high honor. Air accidents occurred before and since the disaster that overtook Flight 529. The next air disaster you hear of may involve a single-engine airplane or a jet transport carrying more than 100 people. At any rate, if the disaster occurs in your general vicinity, it may involve you in your professional capacity. During the past few years, much has been said by pathologists, coroners, and funeral directors in regard to a modus operandi to follow in the event of a disaster of major or minor proportions. As a result, we have few written rules, but many ideas in our minds from which to make decisions. The purpose of this film is to relate to you in some sequence the activities that took place at and about the disaster scene when Flight 529 crashed in DuPage County, Illinois. We hope this report will help others to be better prepared. The DuPage County Sheriff's Office and Fire Department were notified of the disaster immediately. The DuPage County Coroner was represented on the scene by 2:30 a.m. It must be kept in mind that the sheriff in Illinois is the chief law enforcement officer. He is the first to be notified in case of a disaster. It's up to the sheriff to enforce security and roadblocks, and all others should clear through him. The coroner has no jurisdiction until it has been ascertained that there have been fatalities. It is his responsibility to take complete charge of them and their property. The coroner has sole legal responsibility over the remains of persons in an air disaster. However, it is obviously necessary for him to follow a suggested line of procedure which will allow him to give dedicated and responsible service to the human remains and also permit the Federal Air Agency's investigators to examine the remains at the scene in order to obtain whatever evidence can be obtained as to the cause of the accident prior to the time that the bodies are removed from the scene. The coroner's rights include the right to release the remains to the next of kin. The impact area was roped off, and the fire was extinguished by 4 a.m. The hours between 4 and daylight were spent collecting the material that would be needed at dawn. Fingerprinting equipment, wood lath for stakes, large plain tags, black marking pencils, plastic sheets, rubber pouches, and a quantity of small plastic bags. When daylight arrived, the Civil Aeronautics Board and the Federal Aviation Administration were on the scene. It is the duty of the FAA accident coordinator and the CAB investigator in charge to investigate the causes which gave occasion to the disaster. They inspect the aircraft wreckage, examine the records of the flight, and preserve both the records and the wreckage without disturbing them until the investigation no longer required the wreckage to be kept intact in the form it was at the time it hit the ground. Local law enforcement agencies have been instructed to provide the preserving of the records and the wreckage at all costs. This is on the theory that the knowledge obtained will help prevent another similar accident in the future. Portions of the wreckage can be moved only when necessary to assist injured or trapped persons, when necessary to protect the aircraft itself from further damage, when necessary to protect the public, or upon proper release by the Civil Aeronautic Board investigator in charge. The DuPage County coroner sets up teams consisting of sheriff's deputy, a CAB representative, a fireman, and a deputy coroner. The teams included many of the DuPage County funeral directors. The impact area was divided so that no team would have too large an area to cover. A team was given 10 lath and 10 double sets of tags. Each set of tags had already been numbered with a letter representing the team and consecutive numbers. A record was made of the numbers given to each team. As each team proceeded through their area, they placed the stake in the ground by each dead body or part thereof. A tag was placed on the stake, and a plastic bag was placed over the tag to protect the writing. A similar tag was placed on every piece of human flesh. Another team followed with plastic sheets to cover the bodies. For a few feet around every body, property and bits of clothing were tagged with a number that corresponded to the number on the stake. When the teams returned to the command post, they were checked in as to the number of stakes and tags used and the number returned. The tagging took 2 hours. There were 163 stakes set out representing recognizable human flesh. From these pieces, there followed the identity of 78 people. After all of the stakes were in place, the CAB surveyed the area and plotted it out with mathematical exactness. This is very important to them because they must know from the human and mechanical standpoint where all of these people came to rest. Experience has taught us that air disasters, possibly more than any other type of disaster, due to the degree of mutilation involved, can present a very real sanitation problem. One must bear in mind that airline passengers are likely to be from widely varied portions of the nation or of the world. They may be carriers of varied organisms, and the fact that their excreta, viscera, and body fluids are likely to be widely distributed over the impact area adds to the acuteness of the situation. No one should be allowed in the area without overshoes or rubber boots on their feet. Clothing should be protected or should be disposable. Plastic sheets are preferable to blankets for covering the remains. In addition, no one should be allowed to touch anything, particularly portions of human remains, without gloves, preferably rubber ones. The removal of the pieces of human remains began as the stakes were being placed. The DuPage County Sheriff called Mr. John Brust, president of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association, and asked for their assistance. Within minutes, 8 funeral coaches were at the scene. Before the disaster operation was concluded, 21 out of the 23 funeral homes in DuPage County, Illinois, had volunteered their assistance through the county association. The funeral directors supervised the placing of the remains in rubber pouches. A numbered tag corresponding to the number on the stake of the body's location was attached to each pouch. Funeral directors John Brust and John Giles, who's also a deputy coroner, were invited to proceed to the Cook County Morgue in Chicago to arrange for the eventual return and preparation of the disaster victims. Cook County officials had offered their refrigerated morgue facilities to aid in the identification of the remains when it became apparent that the Cook County facilities would be more advantageous for this purpose than any existing facilities in neighboring DuPage County. As soon as the airline was notified of the crash of one of their planes, they set their own machinery into high gear. The airline, of course, had the only list of names of all of the persons on board the ill-fated plane. Soon after the accident, representatives of the airline and representatives of the FBI were at the homes of each of the passengers, obtaining detailed information about each of the victims that would aid in the identification of the remains. They also obtained consent from the next of kin in each case that would enable the airline to act as their duly authorized agent in supervising the return of the remains to their hometown. Mr. Brust and Mr. Giles offered the airline officials the services of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association as a unit. This offer was later accepted after the air carrier had obtained authority to act in this capacity on behalf of the next of kin. It should be pointed out that the operator of an airline has no legal rights as to its passengers after the plane has crashed, and any action taken by the operator without authority from the next of kin in placement or preparation of human remains is done at the operator's own liability. Funeral directors who are involved in the rendering of services or the furnishing of goods for the burial or transport of human remains following an air disaster should first ascertain that they are operating with the authority of the next of kin. If another funeral director, regardless of his location, has been retained by the next of kin, that funeral director has the legal right to the possession of the body as soon as it has been released by the legal authorities. The actual identification of the remains was made at the morgue. 2 teams, each consisting of an FBI agent, a physician, a detective, and a coroner's deputy, provided absolute identifications. Town officials of nearby Westmont, Illinois, which was in the midst of its 40th anniversary celebration, cleared the firehouse and village hall for use as a temporary morgue and operations headquarters. Telephone lines were installed, and by 11 a.m. that morning, preparation facilities were in readiness, awaiting arrival of the identified remains. In the meantime, an emergency meeting of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association had been called, and 70% of the members available were signed in to stand by for disaster service. The members of the association agreed to act as a unit in their negotiations with the airline officials and, as a public service, to collectively underwrite all expenses if that should prove to be necessary. Every casket company in the area was alerted to the immediate need for suitable shipping containers. 60 units were ordered by 11 p.m. the evening of the disaster. They were delivered by truck the following evening. On September 2nd, the day following the disaster, representatives of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association met with officials of the airline who had been authorized to act as agents for the families of the deceased and the airline's insurance carriers. A contract was signed which obligated the Funeral Directors Association to provide professional services, payment of coroner's fees, transportation from the scene to Cook County back to the Westmont morgue, and thence to the point of departure, shipping containers, and payment of all incidental expenses, all for an unspecified sum with details to be negotiated at some later date. A set of rules was drawn up for the management of the temporary morgue facilities at the Westmont Fire Station. These established absolute privacy with only authorized personnel allowed within 1 block of the station, strict sanitary controls, and a carefully supervised checking system. The latter provided a sign-out register at the Cook County morgue and a triple sign-in and register at Westmont. The sheriff's office made 1 check listing the person's name and the number of the body. This included verification of the FBI identification number, a double tag at the head and the foot of each pouch. A separate checklist was prepared by the funeral directors and checked against the sheriff's list. As drivers arrived at Westmont, they signed in for a final check. The first bodies did not arrive at the Westmont morgue for preparation until the afternoon of September 2nd, 34 hours after the crash. The first 26 bodies arrived during a 5-hour period. Embalming took place within the rubber pouches at the temporary morgue. Bodies were injected hypodermically with bulb-type injectors and small trocars. The cavity was treated and powdered, and a preservative powder was added to the pouch. The pouch was then closed, and a sealer was applied to the zipper. 4 men worked in a team on each body. Smoke odors were not too readily apparent because the fire station's smoke ejector was utilized to force the odors through the station fire tower. A Red Cross first aid unit was on duty at the temporary morgue, and strict sanitation was maintained at all times. With each pouch consecutively numbered by the Sheriff's Department and the Funeral Directors Association representative, an exact checkout was made before bodies were finally released. Meanwhile, airline employees worked around the clock assembling family information, identification marks and personal effects, and noting the names of the consignees. The executive secretary of the DuPage County Funeral Directors Association correlated the airline's information for the necessary death certificates, transit permits, and burial permits. Temporary office help made a card file of the official passenger list and cataloged it with special cross-reference numbers. The coroner swore in a special jury for the inquest, as is required in such instances by Illinois statute. The coroner's jury viewed several of the bodies of the disaster victims. The coroner's jury reconvened several weeks later at a special public hearing the Civil Aeronautics Board held to probe into the cause of the disaster. After the public hearing, the coroner's jury was satisfied to call the deaths accidental. Pouches were placed in identical, fully lined sealer caskets, which had been obtained to serve as shipping containers. Then the caskets were sealed, double-tagged, placed in shipping cases, and then double-tagged again. They were stored in a garage adjacent to the fire station up until the time that the bodies were released and sent to the point of departure. Multiple victims from single families were kept together and were transported as family units. 6 members of one family and 5 in another perished in this disaster. A room in the fire station was set aside as a viewing room to permit the next of kin, in some instances, to identify the remains. There was also a temporary arrangement office located in the fire station where relatives could be questioned as to pertinent data about the deceased and the desired disposition of the bodies. At 9 p.m. on Monday, September 4th, after 4 full days and nights of frenzied activity, the remains of the disaster victims were transported to Midway Airport in Chicago to begin their trips to their final destination. 2 air freighters were provided by the airline. One flew east from Chicago, the other west to airports nearest the towns of the consignees. And so, efficiently and swiftly, yet never departing from the dignity and reverence due to those they serve. The funeral directors of DuPage County, Illinois, completed their difficult self-assigned task. Their conduct reflected great personal credit upon each of them and indirectly upon every other funeral director in the country, for no one who read the news reports of their accomplishments could fail to feel greater respect for the funeral directors in their own community. More and more planes are filling the skies. Larger planes, faster planes, planes with increasingly more complex mechanisms. The possibility of human and mechanical error, therefore, increases. And we're certain to be confronted every so often with a crash of one of our commercial airliners. Crashes which could necessarily mean the death of most of those on board. If funeral directors are prepared for such an eventuality, they will be able to better serve the public to whom they have dedicated their efforts. The story of the DuPage County, Illinois Funeral Directors Association disaster operation has been presented here not as an attempt to describe a method of operation that could conceivably be applied to all circumstances, but it is a description of how one group of funeral directors handled one specific disaster. We hope this report will help others to be better prepared.